Hello, this is Kevin Annett. It's February 2nd, 2018, and I have a response to a Canadian Broadcasting Corporation article that came out yesterday that was once again spin doctoring genocide in Canada, this time in relation to the Indian hospitals, where genocidal crimes went on for over half a century across Canada. My article is entitled, "Let the Spin Begin Again. Medical Genocide in Canada finally sees the official light of day." Well, sort of. This is a memo and open letter to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation from yours truly, Kevin Annett. Dear CBC, it's been a while since I wrote to you jokers, but yesterday's news makes it impossible for me to resist dropping you a note. Ever since the spring of 2008, when your corporation's bosses agreed to cooperate with the Canadian government and its partner churches in censoring my name and the evidence of their genocidal crimes out of your reporting, I haven't seen much point in relying on the CBC as a credible platform for the voluminous evidence of those crimes. And sure enough, once again your chronic adulterous union with Big Brother has produced yet another bastard child. Namely, in this case, your after-the-fact paltry depiction of the medical genocide of church-run Indian residential schools and hospitals as just another litigation-bound case of abuse against our poor Indians. Well, I hope I'm not being too impudently un-Canadian when I point out that any media agency that habitually obfuscates official crimes in our Great White North to the extent that the CBC has done does not get to claim the mantle of credible journalism. But be that as it may, and it usually is, I'd like to point out a number of glaring errors, omissions, and misrepresentations in your story on crimes at the Nanaimo Indian Hospital and similar facilities across Canada. I'm doing so on the basis of more than 20 years of on-the-ground research, documentation, and countless interviews with the actual survivors of these hospitals and their associated Indian residential schools. This research that your agency has studiously ignored since the summer of 1998, when it was first offered to the CBC by me. First of all, the Indian hospitals were not government facilities, as you claim. They were established and run by medical missionaries of the United and Anglican churches in conjunction with the Canadian military, specifically the Defence Research Board in Ottawa. Your article doesn't mention the churches of the Army at all. Well, Jeannie, I wonder why that might be. Did somebody say Project Paperclip? Second of all, you uncritically present the official line that these hospitals were so-called tuberculosis treatment facilities. Wrong. That was their cover. Every witness I've interviewed says that they didn't suffer from TB at all and were incarcerated there as children in healthy condition. They were then either deliberately infected with TB or used in drug testing, mind control, sensory deprivation, or sterilization experiments by Army and church doctors. Dr. James Goodbrand, who worked at the Nanaimo Indian Hospital, was quoted as saying to patient Sarah Modeste just before he made her infertile, quote, "I get paid $300 by the government for every Indian woman I sterilize." Lots of women and children died from these horrors and were buried in secret on the hospital grounds. Again, there's no mention of this in your article, despite it being common knowledge among Vancouver Island survivors. Next, rather than describe what went on in these death camps as undeniable genocide, your account spins the whole nightmare as if it's just another case of unfortunate abuse, that the right words and monetary compensation can make all better. Your article even quotes the salivating, waiting in the wings personal injury lawyers and their planned billion-dollar class action lawsuit against Ottawa. But surely even you guys know from experience that lawsuits are just the perpetrator's convenient way of getting legally indemnified and absolved for any consequences for their crimes, as the entire Truth and Reconciliation fiasco has proved ad nauseum over the past decade. For you to even present this medical genocide as a legally actionable issue is to deliberately mislead Canadians. For in case you hadn't bothered to pick up the phone and check, the Canadian government actually officially sealed all of the records of the Indian hospitals in the spring of 1999, soon after our first independent tribunal into these horrors released its report. In fact, as early as 1965, special church and government document destruction teams have systematically wiped clean the evidence of experiments, deaths, and punishments at both Indian residential schools and hospitals. This crucial history is not mentioned in your article. Clearly there was and is a lot of dirt to hide in the Indian hospitals, and the CBC is lending its usual hand in helping conceal these crimes by not mentioning them for years and then functioning as a public censor of the real story. Now here's a case in point. The expert source you quote in your article is Laurie Meyer-Dries, a so-called Native Studies academic from the college immediately adjacent to the grounds of the Nanaimo Indian Hospital, Vancouver Island University, or VIU. Well, guess what, boys and girls? In recent weeks, the very same woman, in league with her fellow Aboriginal bureaucrat Louise Mandel, the VIU chancellor, actually suppressed an article in the campus newspaper The Navigator that was entitled, "Who and What is Buried Next to VIU? Genocide in Our Own Backyard." The article quoted eyewitness Joan Morris, who was imprisoned in the hospital for nearly a decade, as saying, quote, "Lots of people were dying in there. Every morning they were taking little bodies out of the wards on those metal gurneys. My cousin Nancy Jo saw them bury those kids in the field behind us, up near the highway," unquote. Well, the VIU bureaucrats, Ms. Dries and Ms. Mandel, had these words and the entire issue of the Navigator scooped up by campus security to prevent students from reading such evidence of the real crime. Now here's the thing. This rapid on-the-ground censorship of the real Nanaimo Indian Hospital story on the verge of the official spin doctoring of the whole issue by the CBC, well, that couldn't be just a big frigging coincidence, could it? An equally glaring problem about the CBC's pretense of reporting this issue is that your whole account is so completely dated. Ever since June of 1998, all of the stories and evidence about the Indian hospitals quoted in your article has been known and made public by our own independent inquiry into genocide in Canada. Just see itccs.org, folks. Well, for example, Angel Hunt, whom you cite in your article, told me exactly the same account of her mother's torture over 10 years ago in my home in Nanaimo. Angel's words and those of many other survivors have been published by me for many years, along with everything else you need to know to expose the real story of genocide in Canada. And considering the slothful nature of your average Canadian journalist, I've even made the job easy for you guys. It's all posted now online at www.murderbydecree.com, and it's right here in my book, The Crime of Murder and Genocide in Canada, Murder by Decree. You can get that at Amazon, by the way. It only costs you 20 bucks. Well, you know, whether it's in this book, the dozens of other books, articles I've written, the documentary film on genocide, the evidence is all out there already and has been there for many years. Yet suddenly the CBC announces it as breaking news. Because you know all this evidence already, that's the point. And yet you refuse to report any of this evidence or any of the testimonies of our hundreds of eyewitnesses. And in that sense, you, the CBC, are a willing accomplice to that crime. But now, the lawyers and spin doctors have their hands on the issue of medical genocide, and the culprits of church, state, and corporation can once again get away with their crimes with just a bit of litigation. The whole bloody mess has apparently become newsworthy in the mind of the CBC and your government string pullers. Well, newsworthy as long as it's politically expedient. The method and game plan in this latest spin doctrine is identical to the residential schools fiasco, in which mass murder was absolved with an apology and some paychecks, and not a single killer or church-state official ever went to trial, let alone jail. But this time the stakes are even higher, since the medical murder in these Indian hospitals involve the Americans, the CIA's paperclip scientists, and their big pharmaceutical corporate partners that ran and profited off the drug testing, sterilization, and other experiments done on children like Joan Morris. And so once again, thanks to the CBC, the full story of the Canadian genocide is continuing to stay hidden, and the killers are winning the day, at least within our own borders. The witnesses are almost gone, the mass graves are mostly dug up or forgotten, and the erasing of history is itself being erased. But fortunately, a higher accountability and power is at work. And by that I mean not only the accountability and power under the law of God, but the thing called international law. For on April 15th of this year, governments around the world will be asked to begin an embargo and sanctions campaign against Canada and its churches for their crimes against the innocent. Already found guilty of genocide in an international court in 2013, Canada and its sponsors in London and Rome could soon begin to face political and economic heat for their felonies, as will the CBC. And so, since the writing is on the wall, people, what do you have to lose by reporting the whole truth and nothing but the truth for a change? For when the crows do finally come home to rest, you have at least to appear to have done the right thing. And being Canadians, you're good at creating appearances at least. Oh, Canada.